Hi everyone. We're getting a little bit of a later start, so we're going to start right now. My name is Shane Pelche. Welcome. I'm the National Indigenous Homelessness Coordinator with the National Indigenous Homelessness Council. Today I'm here to introduce Irene and her project. Irene is the National Indigenous Homelessness Council's Systems Pathfinder. National Systems Pathfinder, and her project is the PATH process, which is the Personalized Assistance to Housing assessment process. And Irene has a very robust bio, but unfortunately we do not have that here. So maybe Irene can share a little bit about herself, which is awkward because I want to introduce her, but I know that she has quite a bit of history in the work, and I wouldn't want to leave anything out. So maybe I'll bring up Irene and introduce her.
Welcome, everyone. I found myself in this position in May 2021, and I come from a social work background, but I found my way into tool development specifically for Indigenous groups. So it's kind of a niche that I didn't expect to find myself, but I'm really excited to be here. And if you want my full bio, you can see it online, I believe it might be. Okay. So I just wanted to start by thanking both the in-person and the on-demand audience today. So this presentation will share the journey of communities from coast to coast to coast who are leading the development of an Indigenous community-grown process for engaging people experiencing homelessness. And in this session, you'll learn about PATH, the Personalized Assistance to Housing, a process that is by-Indigenous, for-Indigenous, alternative to common assessment tools under coordinated access. And I just want to recognize that I'm a visitor today on this traditional territory, and I flew here today from the traditional lands and waters and unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And this work that we're doing is taking place on many unceded traditional territories from coast to coast to coast, including the Métis Nation homeland. So to give you kind of a roadmap of where we're going to go today, I don't want to skip right to this tool. I want to share the story of PATH and how we got to where we are today. I want to share where we started, talk about the NIHC, the PATH process origins. I want to talk about our journey, all those phase 1 project activities. I do want to tell you where we are today. We're wrapping up phase 1, and I want to give you that overview of the tool, but I also want to tell you where we're going. I want to talk about phase 2 a little bit. So we have lots to share today.
So we're going to share the mic a little bit for the first couple of slides, but you won't have to put up with me for too long because I'm definitely not the main event. Irene is. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge where I come from, and I'm a visitor here in Halifax as well. I'm from Calgary, which is traditionally known as McKinstis in Blackfoot, and it is home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai tribes, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the 3 tribes of the Stoney First Nations, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley bands. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I wanted to share a little bit about the National Indigenous Homelessness Council, kind of where we started, how we got to where we are, and where we're going. In and around 2018, the Indigenous community entities, through Reaching Home, kind of built a coalition of homelessness service providers and started organizing and coming together in a common purpose. And it was posed to the community whether we wanted to organize and incorporate and officially start an organization that carried the voice nationally of the urban Indigenous homeless population. And so the community came together and built that coalition and officially formalized in 2021 and incorporated into the National Indigenous Homelessness Council. Over the course of those kind of formative years, we were given a couple different pots of funding for the development of the coalition. One of them was the national coordinator's position, which is my role that was started by somebody else. And then we, as a group, as a coalition, decided in around 2019 that we asked ourselves, do we want to have a standardized, at that time we called it a tool, but now we call it a process. But did we want to have a standardized assessment prioritization tool developed for the Indigenous community? The SPDAT, the VAT, the VI-SPDAT weren't really answering the needs of the community. And so the group built a framework around what that might look like in the development of that process. So in around 2021, we put out a call and hired our systems pathfinder that would lead that work, and that of course is Irene. And now we are still thinking beyond that initial development of the organization, where we're going as a community, where we're going as an organization, and bringing along this work of the past process. Next steps for us is to move into phase 2 of the past process and piloting it across the country, and then also thinking about next steps for this project, the national coordinator role, and what that might look like and how that might evolve over the coming years, and to see where we want to go as a community. So we're very community-driven, community-led, and our community members make up our board of governors, and so yeah, so that's it on the council. I did want to talk a little bit about the, obviously many of us might be familiar with this coordinated access model, and I wanted to just talk about where the past process fits in, and it would be right around that initial triage and diversion into that assessment component. And one of the things that I was really excited about the project that Irene leads is that it's very kinship based and very relational modeled. And so when we're talking about that initial triage of people coming into the service system, it's so vital that we meet them there in a good way, and in our way, in the Indigenous way. That means through relationship. And Irene has some really beautiful quotes I hope are included in this presentation about tea and what have you. So other than that, I think bring Irene back up. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Okay. So today I'm here to share with you the work on this project that's happening on a national level, but I just want to be really clear that what I'm sharing with you today is not my words. It's the words of many, many, many Indigenous people that have come together to create this from coast to coast to coast. So I'm just here to share all these beautiful minds coming together to develop this Indigenous-led tool. So as you can see on this slide, the plant represents the path process, and there's many different elements around it that have come together to create that. And I'm going to go through each of these elements within my presentation, and that is our journey to growing the path process, because it did start as a seed. It started with that unrest nationally by Indigenous people that said, what we have is not working, and we need to create something that's Indigenous-led and is based on Indigenous knowledge. Someone said, let's get right to the point and see who's going to benefit from all this. Hopefully it's the people, but it has to be done in the right way. So we are hoping that the way we've approached this is in the right way. This is not an expert-driven tool. This is a tool that is developed by community. And so the first place we went on our journey was virtual coffee chats. We got the funding for this project. They said, do a lit review, do some focus groups, develop a tool. But that wasn't a good way of starting this. We wanted to start with the oral knowledge. We knew that, yes, there is some knowledge in the recorded stuff, the articles, but where we were really going to find the heart of this was with the people in community. So we started reaching out to everyone and meeting one-to-one with these virtual coffee chats. And we asked people, where do you want this to go? What do you want this to look like? So we didn't know where we were going. It wasn't It wasn't a deductive approach. We didn't know the end result. We just knew that we were going to develop something, and we let the community decide where they wanted that to be, or what way they wanted that to go. We also asked them if they wanted to be on the PATH working group, which I'm going to talk a little bit more later in this presentation of what that is. And we started with everyone. We started with the IH cabs, the IH community entities. I wanted to get to every level, even the community, the Indigenous organizations in communities that aren't represented by Indigenous community entities. So we tried to gather everyone possible in the Indigenous community to participate in this project and open it up. And it was through those one-on-one chats that this framework was created. So I talked to everyone, I put all those narratives together and coded it and came up with different themes, and this is the framework that we developed from that knowledge shared. And it has 4 really important directions in it. The first is relationships. That relational approach was key. Trust and safety, open and transparent conversations was non-negotiable and was the foundation of anything we moved forward with. In the South, working together, was that we needed to start to work with community-wide circles of care to reduce people retelling their stories and going to multiple services, that us as communities needed to come together, and that ownership needed to be put on organizations and systems. The next in the West was pathways, that we needed to provide holistic supports and resources in the interim to assist with the long-term goal of securing housing. So there's all this work, all that magic that happens before someone actually gets into meaningful housing. And then the last part, the North, is prioritization and decision-making. So that was considered and was told to us that it was an important undertaking of this project. We needed to develop an Indigenous-led framework for prioritization. Someone said, if we don't do it, someone else will. Someone else said, prioritization comes in because we don't have enough resources for everyone, and it comes down on us to prioritize. Who will access the limited spaces available? And so what we did is we took that framework and we started to travel around, a lot virtually, because this is like COVID wave, mid-COVID wave. So we only visited 2 communities in person, which was Ottawa and Yellowknife, and the rest we did virtually. But in total, we did 21 Indigenous community presentations where we shared that framework. We gathered with professionals, we gathered with people with lived experience, and we said, hey, this is what we got so far, where do we take this next? We explored, what does a relational approach look like? What are communities' experiences of working together? What is the diverse range of resources and services being provided in Indigenous communities within the housing journey? And what key elements are being used for prioritization and decision-making when allocating housing? We had these beautiful talking circles, 60 hours of them, where we didn't just ask questions. They were not focus groups. We let the group in front of us tell us what they thought we needed to hear. So they were semi-structured. We had questions if people wanted that guidance, but if the group wanted to take us in a different direction, that's where we went, and that was what we needed to hear in that moment and in developing this tool. And you're gonna notice along this presentation that I'm gonna talk a little bit about how this journey has been different than maybe a traditional research journey. For example, we started with the people in the community, talking to them. And when we went out, we gathered, and we didn't conduct focus groups, we conducted circles where we let them decide the direction of what we needed to hear. So I'm going to point out those differences as we go along. So that was a lot of information. We had our framework, we had all these narratives from all these gatherings. We looked at all those narratives and we brought them down to themes. They gave us more information to really turn that framework into a tool, something that could function in an organization. But we also didn't want to forget about that recorded knowledge, because that oral knowledge mixed with that recorded knowledge is where we get that real rich diversity. And so we scanned the literature for assessment tools and guiding principles for assessment when working with Indigenous people. We looked at the journal databases, EBSCO. We looked at the gray literature through Google. But the key, and this takes us all the way back to those one-on-one coffee chats, is that we asked people, what information do we need to read to create this tool? And we included every article forwarded to us in this lit review. So that's a non-traditional way of doing a literature review. So we not only did like a systematic scan, but we asked people to send us what they thought was important. Those articles that we didn't come across in this scan were included. And all those learnings from that, as well as the community gathering, went into creating the PATH process that I'm going to share with you today. So as you can see, this is a slow process. This has been taking place since the spring of 2021. This is not a fast process. We've taken our time to try to do this in a good way. And anything that brings together that many voices isn't something that's fast. You need people to hear about the project, learn about the project, and then come together. And one way we've come together is through the PATH working group. So going all the way back to those virtual chats, I asked people, do you want to be a part of the working group? And this group is open and accessible. That means anyone that identifies as Indigenous, who either works for an Indigenous-led organization, identifies as an elder, or identifies as having lived experience, or is supported by their community, can join the working group. So anyone in this room that meets that criteria, this group is open and accessible, meaning you can join tomorrow. This is not an exclusive project, and that's an important underpinning value of this work. These people work hard. They meet approximately 4 times quarterly. Sometimes the meetings are an hour or 2. They review documents outside of the working group. I'm not sure who, I know I see one member here. If you're a member of the working group, put your hand up. Okay, so we got some people in the room. So this is an open invitation right now, and my contact information will be on the last slide. And I guess I forgot to mention too, what this group has done to date is that they've taken all those narratives and the development of the tool, and everything goes through them, and they tweak it, and they make changes, and they edit it, and they thoughtfully think about each word and each piece of the tool. So the last thing that we've done on our journey here before coming here today is we did an Indigenous report back to community, and we did that on October 24th. And we wanted to start there because it was important that all these voices that we included, that we go back and say, hey, here's what we did with your voice. And so that was an ethical step that we knew was really important in this work and will continue to do throughout the life of the project. And one thing we did ask anyone that attended that event or registered for that event is, do you have an interest in using PATH in your community? And I thought it was a really great response that we received. 50% people that said yes, and just under 50% said maybe just need looking for more information. And so where are we today? As you can now see, all those elements I talked about have gone into the growth of PATH. You can see the National Indigenous Homelessness Council as the moon, their previous title, the Reaching Home CE CAB Advisory Committee, as the sun. You can see the cloud giving the plant water is those community gatherings that we had, those knowledge circles. You can see those virtual chats, and those literature teachings that we found are the seeds. And then the roots of the plant you can see is the working group. That's our people, our professionals, our elders, and people with lived experience. And so where we are today is that we're wrapping up phase 1 of the project, which is that first draft. It's that first draft of the PATH process. So a lot of work has gone into this. And before I jump into the path process, I want to clarify one term that's really, really important, is that one thing that came out of this work is that both the worker and the person with living experience within the path process are called path walkers. And that was a really deliberate action to use the same term and create less of a power dynamic between those two positions. So whenever I say path walker in this presentation, I'm always going to refer to either it's the person with living experience or it's the worker. But just so you don't get confused, that is a very important part of this tool. And I'm going to throw away that word tool. Now I'm going to try my hardest. So this is the path process, and we came up with an alternative to assessment, but in the process of developing path, we also decided that this is not an assessment, this is not a tool, this is a process. This is a process that identifies a person's housing vision, their resiliencies, needs. It looks at system-level barriers and obstacles for accessing, but as well as retaining housing. And throughout the process, you're going to see, as I'm going to show you here, there's a relational, strength-based, trauma-informed, and empowerment approach, which are foundational elements to help match, and that's a key word there, housing opportunities and an in-term bridge of services and resources. And then there isn't that optional Indigenous-led prioritization component. The path process is tailored to each community, meaning what we've done on a national level is never going to meet the needs of each community. And it's meant for a community to take it. We've taken it to this point, and then the community takes it over and says, this is what we need to change to make it meaningful to our community and make it work with our community. And that respects diversity on a national level. It can be used for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people who are experiencing homelessness, but it is built upon Indigenous knowledge. And it's not meant to be an intake. It is that piece, it's meant to replace that piece in coordinated access, that assessment piece. So the protocol for, I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but the protocol for completing the path process is that it could be a single meeting or it could happen over several meetings. So the way that the path process has been designed is to meet the needs of someone who needs to, only has one meeting with somebody, or somebody who has that opportunity to meet with somebody several times. So the path walker, the person with living experience, shares their story conversationally, but at their pace, telling their story because it's living and it's a continual process. So when I say conversationally, I'm going to show you something today that is what the worker would go to their desk after and complete, but it is not meant to be a question firing process. We've stayed away from questions in the tool, which you're going to see, or in the process, which you're going to see. It's meant to be in a conversational manner. And the reason for that is because that relational approach underpins the path process. It is prioritized over gathering information. If that person can walk away with one thing that day, it's that a good relation between the worker and the person with living experience took place in that meeting. That worker balanced the need to gather information with appropriately being connected to the person who's sitting in front of them. When we think relational, it means that that person is feeling a sense of belonging. They're feeling empowered and they're feeling connected within that relationship. And the reason that is so important is it comes from an Indigenous approach, but it leads to meaningful self-disclosure, which helps connect and match people with appropriate resources and supports. It also results in service retention, so people actually come back. I will read out this quote because it's really good. So this is a community gathering participant. One elder shared that change happens after many cups of tea. And I think that highlights the Indigenous way of connecting and is that relational piece. It's so important because it helps build empowerment with the client. You're not choosing and you're not the expert when we're helping. And it really builds that safety in supporting those individuals, validating them that they matter, their story matters. They're not just a number. They're not just a checklist that we have to get through. When we were doing our community gatherings with lived experience people, someone said, I went in and I got spadatted. And I came out and they gave me a number. And I think he said, I forget what number the person said now, but he said, I have gone through all, this is not his exact words, I have gone through all of this stuff, and to me, I think it's pretty bad, but I'm only a 7, I'm only this, and that means that I'm never going to get housing. So with the PATH process, we never want somebody to leave thinking that they are a number. We want that person to leave thinking that they are worth something. And that's why this relational approach is so vital. So there's many different sections within the PATH process. And I'm going to go through each of the sections. The first one, the PATH Walker profile, that's what the worker fills out, and it's their information. And it is there and available in the system each time they log in. So I forgot to mention, this is meant to be a digitalized tool. It cannot function as a pen and paper system, partially because, mostly because the prioritization component is too complex to do with paper and pen. And that will become clearer as we go through the PATH process, but I just wanted to let you know that. So the PATH Walker profile is something that the worker would fill out before meeting with any clients, and that would always be available. It's not something you have to do with every person. And then there's the initial session steps, and so you would fill out these items, and then if you have the luxury of meeting with somebody for subsequent sessions, you would do number 4 and 5 in those next sessions, but if not, they would also be done in that initial or single session. And then there is a part at the end where people need to fill out after each time they meet with somebody. And so I'm going to go through each of these parts. I'm going to break it down. So there's lots of boring information on these slides, and I'm only going to draw your attention to certain parts of it, but I did want to include all the information so you could really get a sense of what the PATH process looks like. The star items are required items, and for this is the worker profile. So this is what the worker fills out before meeting with anyone. And the most interesting parts on this is, does this person self-identify as Indigenous? And do they identify as having lived experience? And the reason that those questions are included, they're not required, but it came from lived experience narratives in the need for more workers who are Indigenous and have lived experience. So we want to see what that looks like in community. The next part is when you're meeting with somebody, we're jumping into the initial session. The first part is the checklist. On a paper and pen level, this looks really boring, but it actually comes from lived experience narratives. People said, we want open and transparent conversations. We want to know upfront what we're getting into. We want to know that that house is probably years down the road. We don't want it sugar-coated, and that is what this checklist is. It's going over the roles and responsibilities of the program, the worker, and the person, and giving them the opportunity to say, yes, I want to move forward. So this would be done at the very initial meeting with somebody. The next thing you would go work on is the PATH Walker profile. And so remember, this is happening in conversation, and you're going back to your desk after filling out this information. But the most important part on this slide is that we want to know how somebody identifies. So are they Indigenous? And so forth. there's quite a few slides for the profile, but this one goes into, we want to know about their community. We want to know where this person comes from, because the wise practice for understanding and addressing relocation as a barrier to access housing is very important. And that's where we're getting at with this slide. The next part is that we want to know health status. And this is where, like, this whole tool flips the script. We're not looking at personal vulnerability. We're looking at barriers and obstacles to accessing housing on a systems level. But this is the one part of the PATH process that kind of leans a little bit to that vulnerability approach. And so we want to know if somebody is facing a mental illness, physical illness, addiction, or disability, but only if it's affecting their ability to access housing. That's a key part. We want to know a little bit about their household. We want to know if child and family services is involved. So for each dependent, is there a risk of child and family services involvement, or is there current involvement? And the reason for that is that it plays into that prioritization piece. Also included is the total amount of time spent homeless over the past 4 years, as well as their current situation. So are they couch surfing? Are they living on the street, etc.? A little bit about their community connections, and this goes back to the framework of working together, which starts with understanding the workers, the programs, and the organizations connected to the pathwalker, the person with living experience. So you get through all that, and if you have the luxury, you don't go into this next part until you meet with the person again. This is where the magic of the PATH process really happens, is that in that conversation, we want to know what that person's housing vision is. Rarely is somebody asked, where do you want to live? What type of housing do you want to be in? What are your housing requirements, but also what are your preferences? And I know what some of you are probably thinking, well, I can't give this person what they want. They're not going to be able to get their housing vision in this process. But starting there is an empowering approach, asking what does meaningful housing look like to somebody, and being transparent that you're probably not going to get that, but I want to have a conversation of what home looks like to you is so vital. And it's a part of the PATH process that sets it apart from different approaches. We also want to know resiliencies. So what is this person's strengths and hobbies? And often when we talk about strengths or hobbies, it's like, oh, you just write down whatever. But no, this is a vital part of the PATH process, because this part feeds into prioritization. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But it's about getting to know who the person is in front of you, not just a number. It's important to know who they are. And we don't know who someone is unless we see someone sitting in front of us and we see their strengths and we know what they like to do. It's a very important part of having a relational approach. And the last part that really sets this the PATH process apart from other approaches. And I talked a little bit about this, but it flips the script. We're not assessing personal vulnerability. We're not assessing your level of trauma. We're looking at what is stopping you from accessing housing. What are those barriers and obstacles? And that is the major focus of the PATH process. And so there's a laundry list of different barriers and obstacles in the PATH process. And where that laundry list came from was the national gatherings. So when we talk to people in the national gatherings, we ask them, what are the barriers and obstacles to obtaining and retaining housing? And that's what you see in the PATH process. They told us about unable to afford housing costs, not eligible for housing programs, getting assigned mismatched housing, so they're passing on a housing option, or they have loss of housing retention. They told us about difficulty obtaining documents required to access housing. We had heard narratives about housing applications refused or deprioritized due to stereotypes, discrimination, or racism. We heard about requiring housing supports to obtain and retain housing, unable to connect with needed services and resources required for accessing and retaining housing. We heard about feeling uncomfortable accessing an organization which is required to navigate for successfully accessing and retaining housing. They told us about unable to successfully attend required appointments for accessing housing. All of these barriers and obstacles. We heard about relocation, displacement, and migration. I'll go back to that one. So all of these barriers and obstacles, they feed into the prioritization component of the PATH process. But most importantly, it's about asking somebody, what's in your way from getting housing, but also retaining it. And so that's what the PATH process is really getting at. It's not looking at somebody's level of vulnerability. And the last part of the PATH process is a meeting status. And you do this at each session because it's important, yes, to get the meeting information down, the date and time, but most importantly, that worker standing in front of that person is the person who's going to be able to see that that person's not okay in that moment, that they have an urgent safety need that's been identified and it needs to be addressed. And that's so vital because that urgent safety need is a huge part of the prioritization piece of the PATH process. So the worker has the ability to flag a file and say, this person needs housing immediately. It could be violence, abuse, exploitation, but that way we're always checking in, and it can affect somebody's prioritization if that's been identified. And the last part is that interim resources and services. So workers in the gatherings said, we do so much more than just provide housing, and it's not being acknowledged. So by putting this down in the meeting status part, we're recognizing the many, many, many steps of resources and services that workers are putting forward for people experiencing homelessness. And the last part of this is we're identifying somebody's top needs. It's not housing as the need. Identifying somebody's needs is collaboratively identified between both path walkers in what that person needs to do to access and retain housing. So it's that they need this document, they need a referral to mental health or addictions. And so every meeting you're checking in and saying, what are your 3 top action steps that we need to be working on? And those are recorded after each session. So I mentioned this before, but now you're probably thinking, well, you could do that on pen and paper. But I'm going to get to the point where PATH is a digitalized process because of the prioritization component. And before I move into that, I just want to reiterate that everything I just showed you, every piece that was included in the PATH process has been thoughtfully placed there and said, do we need to include this? Are we asking this needlessly? And if we are including it, why are we including it? And the PATH process is meant to be a continually growing, evolving document, which means that as communities use it, it will change and grow with the experiences and the needs of communities. And so the prioritization component of the PATH process has 2 halves, and they're equally important and they can't operate without one another. The first half of prioritization is an automated process. It's called the Intersectionality Decision-Making Matrix, and I'm going to show you a copy of that on the next slide. And what comes out of that automated process and applying this decision-making matrix is a housing list. And I want to be really clearly that doesn't mean that in sequence people are pulled from that list, that in choosing somebody for a housing opportunity, they can be pulled from anywhere on the list. The second half of prioritization is a non-automated process, and it's called the Circle Guide. And basically, it's reflective questions that help a community choose a candidate from the housing list to receive the housing opportunity. And it's where that strength-based approach comes into play. So this is a lot, and I'm going to walk you through it. And this is why PATH has to be digitalized, because this is a complex diagram and it's rules of organization. So when we set out in this, it was said that, we can't use numbers. How do you prioritize without numbers? It's a very difficult task that we were taking on. And so we decided to create a decision-making matrix, which is rules of organization. It was very clear to us. People said, whatever you create, no one is leaving with a number. They are never going to be a number 7. And they also need to know why somebody received housing before someone else. So all the decision-making rules you see on here are created from Indigenous knowledge. Because when we went into those community gatherings, decision-making was already happening. And we asked people, how do you allocate housing? What are those key pieces? And we wrote them all down, and we took the ones that were common from coast to coast to coast, the ones that everyone seemed to agree on, and we created the decision-making matrix using that Indigenous knowledge. And so if you say we have 12 people who are experiencing homelessness, and if you go all the way to the left-hand column of this matrix, you're going to see immediate priority, high priority, and priority. So how do we start with organizing these 12 people who are experiencing homelessness between immediate, high, or priority? And the first thing you need to do is, has an urgent safety concern been identified, or are there dependents involved, or is it a youth transitioning from care? Anyone in that category goes in the immediate priority. And so that's why when workers are saying, hey, I'm looking at this person, they've been flagged as an urgent case, it's so important because our workers are the only people who are on the ground that are going to see that and are going to be able to respond to that. So if someone is flagged as urgent, they immediately go into this category. Or if there's dependent involved and we don't want farther child and family involvement due to homelessness. Anyone who is high priority is either an elder, a senior, a youth, a 2S LGBTQIA+, somebody who identifies with that community. They're all high priority. So anyone that's left that isn't an urgent safety concern or has dependents involved goes in high priority if they're a part of one of those groups. And then the last is anyone that is an adult goes in the priority. Well, now we still have conflicts. We've got 3 groups, but how do we sort through the groups? Well, this is where we move across the matrix. So the first layer of organization for immediate priority, I'm going to go through that one with you. So say we have 4 people that are immediate priority. You're going to take those 4 people and you're going to organize them according to these 5 items. So first, you're going to take your urgent safety concerns with children or youth involved, top. Next, you're going to go to dependents involved with current or risk of child and family services involvement. Then you're going to put urgent safety concerns, followed by just dependents involved or youth transitioning from care. And last is if someone's expecting a child in the next 3 months. Again, there might be conflicts. This is not a perfectly organized list. So you go to layer number 2, and you start to use those rules of organization. This follows, is this person an elder? Are they a part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community? Are they a youth? Next goes adults. But also this category adds in, is this person have a severe condition affecting their ability to access housing? So we talked about this before. Does this person have a mental illness, a physical illness, an addiction, or a disability? So as you can see, everything starts to fall into organization. But even after the second layer, you're especially in a big community, you're gonna still have conflicts. So you go to the third, and this is where those barriers and obstacles to accessing housing come into play. What is the number of barriers and obstacles that that person is facing? And why that is so key is that when we did our community gatherings, people said, it's not that Indigenous people face different barriers and obstacles, it's that they face more barriers and obstacles than somebody who's non-Indigenous. And so it was really important to include that in the prioritization decision-making matrix. The last layer there is length of time homeless, date of intake, and then after you've applied all of these rules of organization, you go on, you have essentially a housing list. But again, you don't pick the top person. You don't pick number one and say, hey, this is your housing opportunity, because it doesn't work that way. We have to think about what is the housing, well, actually before I get there, what is the housing opportunity? Is it a youth house? Is it for adults? Is it for seniors? There's housing criteria. So based on the housing opportunity and the group that are eligible for that opportunity, pull from the list 4 of the top people. Then go to the circle guide, and this is that non-automated strength-based process. And this is where there's a matching process that happens. So we want to look at, does this housing vacancy match the primary applicant's vision, their chosen housing options? So that vision we asked, how does it match up with the housing opportunity? As well, how does this person align with community equity targets? As well as what are their strengths and hobbies, and how will these be fostered within the housing opportunity? And what are their current barriers and obstacles, and identify if this housing opportunity will positively or negatively impact them. So these are all discussion questions that either a group of people from a community can discuss and choose the eligible candidate for the housing opportunity, or one position in a community can be dedicated to going through these reflective questions and then choosing the eligible candidate for the housing opportunity. So it really is a 2-part process. There's this part that gives you the automated list that is created through all the information that the worker input. But then there's this non-automated piece where we're thinking about, how is this person going to thrive in this opportunity? How does it fit with our community equity targets? And this is really getting at that housing retention piece as well. So I promised I'd tell you where we're going. I shared with you where we came from, where we started. I shared with you the tool, where we're at, but now where are we going? So we have this beautiful path process, and we hope to pilot it in 4 pilot locations from coast to coast to coast. We're looking at getting pilot applications in for the beginning of January, which is when our funding should be put into place. We currently have a funding application in. It's in progress. So we will get final determination of that in December. We're gonna choose our pilot location communities in March. They'll all be Indigenous communities. And part of this pilot, I'm gonna go through the 3 elements. First, we're going to digitalize a tailored version of PATH on existing platforms. So that'll be step 1. It can be HIFIS or a non-HIFIS platform. Next, we're going to look at an implementation and evaluation plan for each community, as well as that training and technical plan. Now, the training and technical plan is so important because I talked a lot about this in this presentation about needing to have this as a conversation. And so what we found in the community gatherings is what's even more important than what I shared with you today is how it's done, how the worker goes through the PATH process. So the training and technical plan is a very and equally important part of the PATH process. And then after the pilot, which ends March 31st, 2025, we'll hopefully have launched and started piloting the PATH process in those 4 communities. And in phase 3, we'll move on to completing that pilot. And we'll be sharing our journey along the way with the community. I know that's a lot of information. So I do want to open up the floor to any questions. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you so much for creating this. I mean, HIFIS hasn't even, SPDAT hasn't even worked. Even the creator, SPDAT, said we shouldn't be using it. When you talked about the communities, so for the communities that are going to be the pilot communities, so how is it just going to be pilot for First Nations? Is it going to be pilot for urban communities? Also, we understand that the SPDAT is usually used for homeless and de-assessing the housing. For housing, I'm wondering how much urban Indigenous agencies are participating in the groups or path walkers, and how will the process be, I guess, trickle down to communities for the piloting phase?
So I hope I answer your question fully, but so for the first part, it will be 4 pilot locations, will be Indigenous communities who are applying. So in the South, that's considered an Indigenous community entity is what we call them. In the North, it runs a bit differently, but it is an Indigenous-led project, meaning that Indigenous communities need to be the ones who say, we want this to come to our community and we want to pilot this. That's the first piece. And then I don't know if I quite understand your second question. Can you read? I see what you're saying, yeah.
So that's why I'm wondering, like, how would the actual phase will actually trickle down to actually go to the communities that have higher levels of vulnerability and that are rarely accessed a housing application?
Yes, okay, so I'll answer the first part of that. So the PATH process, like actually filling out, I can't go back there, but actually filling out the information is meant to be done after you meet with the person. So part of that training and technical piece will be training workers to have conversations with people where they can bring a pen and paper to take notes so they don't forget something, but it's meant to be a relational process. So you are gathering information, but it happens in relationship and in conversation. So never would a laptop or an electronic be pulled out. That would be done after when you're completing your notes. And so so each visit, you'll have a conversation with the person, and then after the visit ends, you'll go input the information into the assessment tool, boxes, and then the prioritization rules pull that information and create the housing list. This was developed and meant to be initially used with just Indigenous people, but then it was said this could also work for non-Indigenous people as well, and it was developed for coordinated access, but it can also be used outside of coordinated access in the homelessness sector if people see value in using it. It doesn't have those bounds. Does that answer it? Okay. Go ahead, Paul.
Hi, Irene.
Hi.
So, in Sault Ste. Marie, where I come from, we are the Indigenous stream of reaching home there's also a designated community. And so OFIFC is our community entity, an Indigenous organization, but we are living in the urban community of Sault Ste. Marie. So would we be able to be considered for the pilot, although we're not a direct Indigenous community? It's kind of similar to the previous question, but a little more complicated maybe.
Yeah, so I think that links to the digitalization of it. So we've really been pushing to get funding to digitalize it. And right now we have funding to digitalize the path process, but only integrated on an existing platform. So that's like HIFIS or a non-HIFIS platform if you're a non-HIFIS community. Now that creates a huge barrier because if you're a community that doesn't have access to a shared database, you can't use paths. So what we're doing is we're sourcing other funders right now to look at, because our goal is to create Path as an external software that can be used in rural and remote communities like yours, Paul, or different locations. Because what we've found through the narratives is that when you limit it to HIFIS or a non-HIFIS database only, then you're limiting the number of organizations and people that you're actually able to help. And so they found, one community found that when they opened it up past the system to other organizations, that they were more adequately capturing hidden Indigenous homelessness. So that's definitely a barrier that we're facing with funding right now, but it is not going to stop us in trying to find other funding and not going to stop us in continuing to advocate that being limited by an existing platform is just another barrier and obstacle.
So Sault Ste. Marie is an urban community. We're remote, kind of, but we are an urban, and we do have HIFIS, and the designated community is the holder of the license, but we've been invited to participate in it, and so we do have HIFIS accessibility. In fact, maybe we might even be able to convince the community to switch totally to the path process for the whole community. So.
Yeah, so the path process definitely doesn't replace like a shared database system, but it is meant to accompany a shared database system. So if it did exist as its own software, it would just mean that everyone in the community, whether they had a login for HIFIS or non-HIFIS systems, would be able to use the path process beyond that. So your answer to your question is yes, because I know your organization is going to be connected to HIFIS. You would be an eligible pilot community location at this point in time. But I want to be really clear that we are continuing to advocate to have it as an external software because it's not ideal. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries, Paul. Thank you. Any other questions? Here's some seeds as well for anyone who's thinking about a question. Go ahead.
So you talked about how the conversation happens, the worker goes away and is kind of filling out those ticky boxes.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious about what that conversation looks like, because I heard you say that it's not a question-based connection. And so how do you gather that information in a way that isn't question-based?
Yeah, so that's a part of phase 2. So a part of phase 2 is developing the training and technical plan, which is the how. How does the worker have this conversation in a good way? How do they, and so that comes into the training plan, and then rolling out that training with workers. What did I want to say in there? Oh, I've lost my thought, but yes, so that is a part of phase 2, and it's a very important piece. Oh, I know what I was going to say. A part of this will probably also involve some infographics, so people can have like an infographic to go over maybe like the barriers and obstacles piece or the strength-based piece. That's just an idea that's been put forward, but exactly what it's going to look like will be rolled out in phase 2. Go ahead.
I think you sort of alluded to some of this just now, but have you thought about qualifications required for the workers to engage in this process?
Yeah, so one of the big things that communities have been telling us, and I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, is that there's a high turnover rate. So we've already started to think about what does this training and technical piece look like in the homelessness sector that has high turnover rate. So we've been, I'm not going to go into depth in that, but we do need to come up with a plan in how to roll it out in a way that meets, that this high turnover isn't a barrier to people being able to use the PATH process. Yeah, I think that answers it, yeah.
Little high for me, but that's okay. I work at the Friendship Center here in Halifax, so I work with the urban Indigenous population. I forget what part of the process it was in, but there was a question about why folks left their communities. I just wanted, I guess it's more of a comment, but there wasn't an option for folks that have been banned and or exiled from their communities, just because a lot of the clients that we work with, that is the case. So I enjoyed the questions about kind of what it looks like for the urban Indigenous population as well. But I just think that that's something people will come across a lot using this system.
Thank you. I'm going to add that. And that's an important part, because just like that just happened in this room, as we start to use the PATH process, it's going to evolve and change. And so those, like, that list of possible answers is going to begin to grow and really accurately reflect beyond, the community gatherings information that we gathered. Also, I want to go back to that last question on the training and technical piece. I forgot to mention this, but so for the training and technical piece, that'll be developing the capacity. Part of that will be developing the capacity of the community and providing the core competencies that a worker will need to deliver the PATH process. But we also, even beyond training for the PATH process, in the Phase 2 budget, we've included funds for each pilot community to bring forth their own local trainers and different areas that they think are important to train in as well. Is there any other questions?
So with coordinated access, we're basically mandated to use HIPES. And if you're trying to establish PATH or something that is outside of HIPES, is that going to be?
So PATH is going to be integrated into HIFIS. Yes. Yeah, so, and HIFIS communities have asked us for that. So they said it's important that the PATH process is integrated. The external software is that we hope to build in the future is for those communities that are say in a HIFIS community or in a non-HIFIS community, but don't have access to a shared database system.
Hi. One of my questions is with the path walker that's the worker, and considering high turnovers, considering barriers to people getting the education that they need to do this kind of work. Like, you have on your list that they have to be identified as Indigenous, but what if they don't, but they work with an Indigenous organization?
So that's the path walker, so the worker's profile. And so the question in there is, do you self-identify as Indigenous? And so it's not a required question. They can opt out of filling that out. And they don't have to be Indigenous. But if they do want to fill it out, they can say, I do self-identify as Indigenous. Also, the other one is, I self-identify as having lived experience. And that's a way to capture that data on who are people who are working in the homelessness sector Indigenous, and do they have lived experience when we're working with people who are Indigenous particularly.
Okay, because I was just wondering, because that could be a barrier even for your communities that you start doing the pilots with. If you don't have Indigenous, a whole staff of Indigenous workers.
Yeah, it's not necessary. It's more a data collection point, and it came from the lived experience narratives in terms of lived experience. People said, we want people with lived experience to be working with us and people who are Indigenous. So it just might highlight exactly what you're saying, is that even though we really have this high Indigenous homelessness population, there's actually not a lot of Indigenous workers, which is probably the narrative in the story we'll end up finding.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Julian.
To that point additionally, if there are agencies with multiple workers, that profile might help match a worker with a pathwalker with living experience. If they're, say, part of the QSLGBTQ plus community, or if they have lived experience, or if they are Indigenous, especially if it identifies them from a particular community, a person with living experience might feel more comfortable with a pathwalker worker who is similar to that personality.
Good point, Julian. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? I have a question for the group. Can you envision using PATH in your community? Or are there any elements that you thought that were shared today that you think are useful or maybe would be challenging to use in your local communities? Go ahead.
I'm from Winnipeg, and so one of the barriers we have is there's about 3 low-income housing units for every 20 people that need housing. So when I see this, often it's just like there's not all the science behind it or not all the narrative behind it. It's just like when you take a spot, you get it, and you try to fit somebody. But I'm also thinking about this in terms of like our service prioritization, like things we've typically used the SPDAT for. I hope you pick Winnipeg. It could be so incredible. But yeah, awesome. Thank you.
So Winnipeg is applying. Said Winnipeg's applying based on that comment. I see a question at the very back there.
I'm from Nova Scotia. I love the fact that you created all this, but a big barrier, just I know in my community alone, is the education piece behind it, the internet access behind it, and everything else. So if you're going to do these pilot programs, are you going to make sure that the internet's available in the community? Because that is a big issue in Nova Scotia at this time. And then the education of them knowing what is actually on that internet-based data. You have somebody walking it through, but it's like them understanding and knowing the questions that are being asked in front of them and their relationship. Like when you're saying there, somebody that it has to be lived experience, someone that looks like me, I will trust, versus someone that doesn't look like me and doesn't know what actually I'm going through. Just saying.
Thank you, yeah. So definitely in terms of internet, the PATH process is meant to do without the computer. It's meant to be a conversation with the person. So when you're in community meeting with people, you don't need to have access to the internet, but you will need to have access to the to complete the PATH process on a computer later. So inputting the information. And so we would need to work with communities to make sure that whatever pilot organization locations have proper access to it, as well as that training piece will be a part of the pilot program. So any pilot community that is chosen will be there'll be staff working on the project to help roll out the training and technical piece with each community. And what that looks like will be not told to the community. Like the communities get to decide what they need and how they want it to look. So we're bringing it as far as we can by basically providing a template, and then we give it to the community and they say, this doesn't work for us, this does, we want to change this. So that's a really important part of the PATH process, is making sure that whatever challenges do come up, that we're working with communities to solve them, and that it's not like a cookie cutter template. I hope that answers it to the best of my ability. Any other questions or challenges that you think you'd face?
So it's for coordinated access. So the multiple interviews, I could see that adding up in that, like, typically I'm an intake and assessment coordinator, and I see about 4 people a day. And then So,
I think the person that's applying or getting that help, it's important that they have that relationship, like they can provide more information by feeling comfortable with that person. So I think that's what they're trying to get at, is more reading, see how the person, like having a help and see, like if they're saying, getting that person like knowing and knowing who they are, then you get an idea of where their mental health is, and just if they're stable.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? It's like getting to know that person. And I believe that because I worked with homeless people for the last 17 years. And that's what they say, that it's important for workers to sit down with us, even just over a meal, or coffee or tea, having that interaction with each person so they feel important. And that's what I'm trying to work on with my staff, like getting them out there. It's an old guys. So you get an idea how they are.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I'm just internally combating, is it more important to get as much as done as I can, or get them done quality?
The thing is that the housing piece is not going to come right away.
Exactly.
I'm just,
Take back from the amount to get better quality.
and it's getting worse every year, like the housing piece, like you see a lot of tents all over across Canada, even here.
So-
By near the waterfront, there's a little park.
it's interesting to hear you both speak because you're right, like we have this ideal and we know that that is a good way, but then we have the system and we have the pressure of the system, and so it's like, where do we find the balance? So the path process is hoping that we can move towards this, but it understands that we have the system pressures, and so we need to work with each community and say, what does your coordinated access look like? And how can we move towards this approach as much as possible, working within the system and those pressures? And so, yes, ideally it would be multiple sessions, but frankly, some communities might not be able to get there. But maybe we could move there slowly, or we could test it out and try it a little bit closer to this ideal and see what works for each community.
I just wanted to add that I agree myself when working together with the react to that side, just because it's a very triggering tool, and I just let it come out naturally because I knew that this person from the get-go was going to be so triggered by it, he would shut down. So, like, I'm already doing the building relationship part, because I'm not going to intentionally trigger someone because somebody wants it done now.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing too, is, like, we had 2 intake assessment coordinators, and then we only have 1 now currently. And so I have walk-ins 3 days a week and stuff, but then I'm also at bookings, and I'm booking into December. And that's where I'm like, I need to get as many done as I can, but obviously I'm one person, so yeah, I could get more staff, and that could be more easy to accomplish and stuff like that. But no, I'm going from my mental state of, I have to get as many in as I can. Even at my walk-in, when I'm supposed to do 3, I'll try to get 4 sometimes, but then that's not as quality as getting a thorough assessment.
Yeah, so if your community was, a community that was chosen, we'd have to really like pull that apart and sit down and decide like, how can we make this work for your community within the confines or the bounds that you have, but how can we move towards what people are saying, through the community gatherings is a good approach. And
Well, yeah, I really enjoyed this, just the thought process, because I've been
Yeah.
stuck in the get stuck.
I don't think you're the only one, I think.
So you're gonna pick really challenging communities for your.
That's right, yeah. We are going to provide like as many supports as we can to pilot communities and work very closely with them to go through the path process and actualize it. So it should be a really engaging, journey, and I hope that, I can stand here and share, the next time I stand here, I can share what that journey looked like, and I'm sure the many lessons we have ahead of us, so.
So you're based from Ottawa? That's where the Wellness Center is?
I live in Ottawa, and Wabano is where my position is hosted right now. But it's moving over to the National Indigenous Homelessness Council for Phase 2, and they are based in Calgary, but I'll be working remotely.
Yes, so I wondered if the applications for the quality community that already been, like, is the deadline gone and over in January 2023, or is it still open?
No, they'll open in January, so I'll probably be providing like an info session and releasing and opening them. And then we'll be picking those communities like late February, March.
Okay, so how will that information be out to the community? Because I noticed from your research, I work in the Research Center in Land Labrador, and a lot of the information here is missing that province. So I'm just wondering how that information would go out to communities.
It'll be going out to definitely all the Indigenous CEs. But if you really are thinking, I want to be a part of this, my information is up there, and if you email me, I'll make sure that you're included personally.
Yeah, just super quick wanted to mention maybe an obstacle as I appreciate that you included QSL folks there, but for safety concerns, sometimes people hide and don't feel willing to disclose that information. But I think maybe that can be addressed in some of the training, so just to highlight that.
Thank
That
you.
intersectionality and that just adds that other layer. But so if that, maybe that person won't disclose that, so it's not counting in their, in your assessment. Oh, yeah, just to mention that.
Yeah, that's really valuable information, and I think the training and technical piece for how to approach that part of the PATH process, we're going to have to reach out to the community and ask them what we need to do to make sure that it's done in the right way. Okay. Well, I'll end it there. I'll stick around if there's any other questions, but I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you.